The first time I realized the HOA was going to be a problem was when I found 3 neon orange traffic cones lined across the one-lane bridge to my ranch, and a folding lawn chair occupied by a woman wearing a sun visor big enough to block satellites. She had a clipboard, a thermos, and the facial expression of someone who believed she was in charge of the world, or at least the bridge. I rolled down my truck window and asked, as politely as I could, if she was lost. She smiled, the kind of smile that meant she had a plan and I wasn't going to like it. "You can't cross here," she announced, in the same tone TSA agents use when telling you your shampoo bottle is a national threat. "That's going to be tricky," I said, nodding toward the miles of pastureland visible beyond her shoulder. "Because my house is on the other side." She tapped her clipboard like it was a gavel. "The HOA voted to restrict access to this bridge for non-residents. Now, here's the thing about living in a rural area: the term non-resident can mean a lot of things, but usually it doesn't mean the guy whose name is literally on the land deed. And definitely not the guy who, by the way, owns the actual bridge. Of course, I didn't mention that last part right away. I wanted to see where she was going with this, like watching a kid explain why they're allowed to eat ice cream for breakfast because it's dairy. She adjusted her visor. "We've had too many outsiders driving through. It's disruptive. The board voted yesterday, unanimous decision." "That's impressive," I said. "Voting on property you don't own." Her eyebrows lifted. "The bridge is part of the community." I leaned an elbow out the window. "So is common sense, but you don't see everyone enforcing that." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll have to turn around." Now, I had 2 options. I could floor it, which would send her lawn chair tumbling and probably end up with the sheriff showing up. Or I could play the long game. I've always preferred the long game. So I smiled, nodded, and backed up slowly. By the time I turned my truck around, she was already on her cell phone, no doubt reporting her first victory to whoever in the HOA kept a scoreboard. I drove away, parked down the road, and took the walking trail along the creek that eventually fed under the bridge. 20 minutes later, I was on my own porch sipping coffee. The bridge wasn't just my access to the ranch, it was my property. I'd bought it years ago from an elderly neighbor whose family didn't want to deal with upkeep. Technically, anyone who wanted to cross had to have my permission. But apparently, the HOA thought they could claim squatters' rights through sheer arrogance. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped at the hardware store. Bought a few laminated "Private property, no trespassing" signs and a sturdy chain. Then I called my lawyer, a man who charged by the minute but was worth every penny for his ability to turn HOA presidents into puddles of legal compliance. He confirmed what I already knew: they had 0 claim on the bridge. If they wanted to play access games, I could play too. On day 3, I arrived at the bridge at sunrise. My chain clanked satisfyingly as I locked it across the entrance. By 7, the sun visor woman arrived, this time with 2 other HOA board members and matching pastel polos. Their golf carts lined up like a very suburban cavalry. She waved her clipboard at me. "You can't do this." "Sure I can," I said. "Private property. This bridge belongs to the community." "Nope. It belongs to me. Got the deed in my truck if you'd like to see it." One of the men stepped forward. "If you block access, we'll have to contact the county." "Please do," I said, fishing my phone out. "I'll save you the trouble. Sheriff's number is right here." They didn't expect that. The woman narrowed her eyes. "You're making a mistake." I almost laughed. "No, I'm making coffee." "You're making a scene." They left in a slow retreat, whispering furiously to each other like middle schoolers plotting revenge. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. The HOA was formally requesting that I remove the chain and restore access to the community. The letter was signed by the board president and cited community bylaws, none of which applied to my land. I drafted a reply that simply read, "Request denied. Bridge is private property. Any unauthorized crossing will be treated as trespassing." 2 days later, I caught sight of them testing my chain with a pair of bolt cutters. I walked down from the porch with my phone recording and announced, loud enough for the camera, that they were attempting to damage private property. They froze like deer in headlights. The man holding the cutter set them down slowly, as if I might be a park ranger and he was caught poaching. By the following week, the bridge war was in full swing. They parked a golf cart at the far end to monitor traffic, which meant waving down every car and giving them a speech about how I was cutting off the lifeline of the community. I heard from my nearest neighbor that they were telling people I'd bought the bridge purely to spite them. That part was actually funny, because until that week, I barely thought about the HOA. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about them, and the absurdity of people trying to take over something they had no right to. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. Late one night, just after midnight, I heard tires crunching on gravel. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. There, halfway across the bridge, was a moving truck, stuck. The driver was leaning out the window, cursing, while two men tried to push it backward. The chain was gone, cut clean through. When I walked up, the driver looked like he'd seen a ghost. "They told me it was fine," he stammered. "Said they owned the bridge?" I shone my light on the cab door. The logo of a local moving company was printed there. "Who's they?" He swallowed. "The HOA president. She hired me to move furniture from her house tonight. Said I could cross here because it was part of the community." I took a photo of the broken chain, then the truck, then the driver's license. "You're leaving now. And you're paying for the chain." As they scrambled to back the truck off my bridge, I realized this was no longer just about access or property rights. They had crossed into criminal territory. And if they thought I'd been patient before, they were about to see what it looked like when I stopped playing nice. By sunrise, I'd already printed out the photos from the night before: the moving truck, the cut chain, the driver looking like he'd just been caught stealing the crown jewels, and dropped them into a manila envelope. Inside was also a copy of the property deed and a short, to-the-point note. "Consider this your final warning before law enforcement is involved." I slid it under the HOA president's door on my way into town, resisting the urge to knock just to see her face when she found it. At the sheriff's office, Deputy Harris didn't even blink when I told him what happened. "This wouldn't be the first time they've overstepped," he said, flipping through my photos. "But breaking a lock and crossing private property is a different level. We can file a formal trespass complaint." "Make it formal," I said. "And let's throw in destruction of property while we're at it." He nodded and started the paperwork. While he typed, he said, "You know they're going to try something else, right?" "That's why I'm here before breakfast," I said. By the time I got home, there were 3 HOA board members standing in the middle of the bridge like it was a protest site. The president, sun visor, clipboard, pastel cardigan, looked up at me with the triumphant smirk of someone who thought she'd found a loophole. "We've reviewed the matter," she announced, "and determined that your claim to the bridge is invalid because the community has been using it for over 20 years. I raised an eyebrow. "You're going for adverse possession? Cute. Takes 7 years in this state, and I bought it 10 years ago." "Nice try." One of the men muttered something about consulting the HOA lawyer, which made me laugh out loud. "Please do that. He's going to love billing you for telling you I'm right." They didn't move, so I got out of the truck and walked up to the chain I'd replaced that morning, this one thicker and with a keyed padlock. "You're currently standing on private property," I said. "That means you have about 30 seconds to leave before I call Deputy Harris." "You can't threaten us," the president snapped. "I'm not threatening," I said, pulling my phone out and starting the camera. "I'm documenting." They left, muttering about bully tactics and selfish landowners, which was a bit like a burglar complaining that a homeowner locked the doors. That afternoon, a letter appeared in my mailbox, not certified this time, just stuffed in without a stamp. It was written in red ink, like a ransom note, and read, "If you cut off the bridge, you cut off the heart of the neighborhood." No signature, but the handwriting looked suspiciously like the president's. I pinned it to my fridge as a trophy. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. I knew they were regrouping, and I wasn't wrong. On day 4, I woke up to the sound of construction equipment. Looking out the window, I saw a rented skid steer at the far end of the bridge, dumping gravel into what looked like the start of a bypass road through the woods. I drove over, parked, and walked up to the guy operating the machine. He cut the engine and gave me a wary look. "They hired me to make a new access road," he said. "Through my land?" He blinked. "They didn't say that." I pointed at the survey stakes I'd put in years ago, which clearly showed the property line. "Yeah, they left out that part. You're working on private land. That means if you keep going, you're trespassing." He didn't argue. He loaded the skid steer back on his trailer and drove off. Less than an hour later, the HOA president was on my porch, furious. "You had no right to interfere with community improvements," she snapped. "You had no right to order them on my land," I said. "That's called trespassing. Try it again, and I'll have the sheriff here before your golf cart battery dies." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "You're isolating us from emergency services. What if someone needs an ambulance? Then they take the county road, just like they always have," I said. "You're not stranded. You're just inconvenienced." The next twist came faster than I expected. That evening, a county code enforcement officer showed up at my door with a clipboard of his own. "We've received a complaint about unsafe conditions on your bridge," he said. I almost laughed. "Let me guess who called." He didn't confirm, but the smirk was telling. "I do have to inspect it, though." "Be my guest," I said, grabbing my flashlight and walking him out. The bridge was fine, better than fine. I'd reinforced it 2 years ago with new beams and decking. He gave it a thorough check, then closed his clipboard. "Looks solid to me. I'll note that in the report. Do me a favor," I said as we walked back. "When you file that, make it clear the complaint was unfounded." "Already planned on it," he said with a grin. By the next morning, word had spread that the inspection had gone my way. The HOA's new strategy was to start a whisper campaign, telling people I was planning to sell the bridge to a developer who'd turn it into a toll crossing. Neighbors I barely knew started calling, asking if it was true. I told them the truth, that the only toll was patience, and the HOA was already overdrawn. But the real escalation hit a week later, when I came home to find a handmade wooden sign planted at the end of the bridge. It read, "HOA Community Property, all welcome." They'd even stenciled little flowers along the border, like that would somehow make it legally binding. I took it down, drove it straight to the sheriff's office, and dropped it on Deputy Harris's desk. "They're claiming ownership of my property in writing now," I said. He whistled. "That's bold. Let's make this official." That was when he suggested something I hadn't considered, filing a no trespass order against the entire HOA board. "They want to cross, they'll have to get your permission in writing," he said. I liked the sound of that. By the end of the day, the paperwork was in motion. It wasn't just about keeping them off my bridge anymore. It was about making sure they couldn't touch it without a court date hanging over their heads. When the order was served, I happened to be on the porch, sipping coffee. The look on the president's face when the deputy handed her the papers was the kind of thing you wish you could bottle and sell. Of course, that wasn't the end of it. That night, I caught movement on my security cameras, 3 figures, flashlights in hand, creeping toward the bridge. They stopped halfway, looked up at the camera, and bolted. In the morning, I found a single item lying on the decking, a dropped HOA keycard, the kind they used for their clubhouse. I pocketed it. They were getting desperate. And desperate people, especially entitled ones, tend to make their biggest mistakes right before they lose for good. 2 days after the keycard incident, I started noticing something odd. Every time I drove into town, I'd see one of the HOA board members parked near the bridge entrance. Sometimes it was the president in her golf cart, sometimes one of her pastel-shirt lieutenants in a sedan, but always with binoculars, pretending to bird watch. The only birds they were tracking were the ones driving pickup trucks across my bridge. I wasn't sure what their plan was, probably gathering evidence for some grand complaint, but I decided to give them something worth documenting. That afternoon, I backed my flatbed trailer across the bridge and started unloading lumber, posts, and a set of gates I'd picked up at an auction the week before. Sure enough, the golf cart appeared within 10 minutes. The president leaned on the wheel like she was about to witness a crime. "What are you doing?" she called out. "Installing gates," I said cheerfully. "You like them?" "Found a great deal." "You can't do that. You're restricting public access." "Correct on the first part," I said, "and wrong on the second. This isn't public. It's mine. You'll need a code to get through when I'm done." Her jaw actually dropped. "That's outrageous." "Only if you're on the wrong side of it," I said and went back to work. By sunset, the gates were installed, heavy steel, tall enough to deter climbing, with a keypad entry system. I programmed a code for the sheriff, the fire department, and a few trusted neighbors. The HOA didn't make the cut. The next morning, the code enforcement officer was back. "Got another complaint," he said, glancing at the gates. "Let me guess," I said. "The bridge is now a dangerous security hazard?" "Pretty much," he said with a sigh. He walked the length of the bridge, inspected the gates, and finally shrugged. "Nothing wrong here. Your property, your rules." When he drove off, I noticed two of the board members in their golf cart, whispering like they'd just been told the ending of a horror movie. That night, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the bridge camera. 3 hooded figures were clustered around the keypad. I watched in real time as they tried random codes, failed, and then pulled out what looked like a crowbar. I was dialing the sheriff before they'd even landed the first hit. Deputy Harris arrived in record time, catching them halfway through trying to pry the gate open. Turns out, all 3 were HOA board members, including the president. Watching them line up beside the patrol car for questioning was satisfying. Harris cited them for attempted property damage and trespassing. No arrests, but it was enough to rattle them. The next day, I got a formal notice from their lawyer claiming the gates were an unreasonable barrier to community safety. I sent back a single-page response, a copy of the trespass citations, stapled to a sticky note that read, "Guess again." That should have been the peak of the absurdity. It wasn't. The twist came the following week when I got a call from the county clerk's office. "You might want to come down here," the clerk said. "We've had a unique filing regarding your property." I drove down, and she slid a document across the counter. It was a community easement agreement, signed by the HOA board, claiming permanent rights for all residents to cross my bridge. They had even recorded it in the public land records, without my signature. I stared at it for a long second. "This is forged," I said. She nodded. "Yep. Which is why I called you before we processed it further. Thought you'd want to see who signed it." The signatures were all the board members' names. I took a photo and emailed it to my lawyer before I left the building. 10 minutes later, he called me back, sounding like Christmas had come early. "This is fraud, plain and simple," he said. "You realize this could put them in serious legal trouble, right?" "Good," I said. By the end of the day, the sheriff had copies, the county had voided the filing, and my lawyer had drafted a cease and desist letter so sharp it could have drawn blood. The HOA's response? They scheduled a special meeting in their clubhouse and mailed invitations to every resident, except me. Naturally, I heard about it anyway from a neighbor who wasn't thrilled with their antics. Curiosity got the better of me. On the night of the meeting, I parked just far enough down the road to watch the crowd gather. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw the president pacing at the front of the room, waving papers and pointing toward the bridge like it was a cursed relic they needed to destroy. An hour later, the meeting broke up. People left in small, murmuring clusters. A few glanced my way, but most avoided eye contact. The next morning, I found a fresh sign planted at the end of my driveway. "Stop the bridge bully, vote HOA strong." That was the moment I decided I was done just defending. I was going on offense. I called in a favor from a friend who runs a local history blog. He came out, took photos of the bridge, and wrote up a glowing piece about its unique design, its age, and, most importantly, its private ownership. He also mentioned the recent disputes, framing the HOA's behavior as petty and overreaching. By the end of the week, the post had gone semi-viral in the county. Comments poured in from people who had their own HOA horror stories. The local paper picked it up, too, and ran an article titled, "Private Bridge Sparks Public Feud." The HOA hated it. I knew because 2 days later, I saw the president in the grocery store, glaring at me over the cantaloupes like I'd stolen the last one. She didn't say a word, just turned her cart sharply and disappeared down another aisle. But the real payoff came when a county commissioner reached out, asking if I'd be willing to host a charity event on the bridge, a fundraiser for local flood victims. It would be perfect PR for me and a nightmare for the HOA. I agreed instantly. We set the date for 2 weeks later. I made sure to invite everyone in the area, even the HOA members. They'd either have to attend and smile through it, or skip it and look like the villains they were. The night before the event, my cameras caught more movement at the bridge. This time, it wasn't subtle. Headlights blazed, and a pickup truck backed right up to the gates. 2 figures jumped out and started cutting the chain, not the lock, the entire chain. I was in my truck and down the driveway in under 2 minutes. My headlights caught them red-handed, the president and her vice president, both holding bolt cutters. They froze. "You know this is all on camera, right?" I said, stepping out. Her voice was shaky now. "You're ruining this community." "No," I said. "I'm saving it from you." The next morning, as guests arrived for the fundraiser, the gates stood wide open, but not because the HOA had won. The sheriff himself was stationed there, greeting people and reminding them that any unauthorized tampering with the gates was now under criminal investigation. And as I watched neighbors cross the bridge, laughing and chatting, I knew the HOA's grip was slipping. They weren't just losing the bridge, they were losing the crowd. The fundraiser was a hit before it even started. By 10 in the morning, cars lined the county road in both directions, and the smell of barbecue drifted across the pasture. I'd set up tables along the bridge, each one draped in red and white checkered cloths. There were jars for donations, coolers packed with drinks, and a big banner that read, "Bridge for Good, Flood Relief Benefit." The HOA had to watch it all from the sidelines, literally. They parked their golf carts just beyond the property line, close enough to keep tabs but far enough to avoid stepping onto the bridge without permission. The president wore an enormous pair of sunglasses and a stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. It didn't help that half the people attending made a point of walking past her with plates of food, offering cheerful greetings like nothing was wrong. If anything, the tension made the atmosphere more electric. Folks were talking, laughing, and dropping bills into the donation jars like it was a small-town fair. By noon, we'd raised over $2,000. Local musicians played from a flatbed truck parked at the center of the bridge. Kids chased each other between the tables. The sheriff stopped by, shook my hand, and congratulated me on the turnout. Then the first hint of trouble rolled in, literally. A slow-moving convoy of 3 golf carts pulled up on the county side of the bridge. All were driven by HOA board members, and all had handmade signs taped to the sides. "Stop the bridge takeover, community access now," and my personal favorite, "Gates equals greed." The musicians faltered for half a beat before picking up again. People turned to look. Some laughed, others shook their heads. The president stood in her cart, megaphone in hand. "Attention!" she called, her voice carrying over the music. "This event is being held on property that rightfully belongs to the community." I stepped forward before anyone else could answer. "Actually," I said, projecting my voice, "this event is being held on my private property, which I have generously opened for a good cause. And if you'd like to donate to flood relief, there's still time." Scattered applause broke out. Someone yelled, "Sit down, Karen!" which earned a wave of laughter. The president's face flushed, but she pressed on. Don't be fooled. He's using this event to distract from the fact that he's cutting off emergency access. I raised an eyebrow. The county road is still open. EMS has the gate code. You're the only ones being inconvenienced, and that's because you tried to steal my bridge. That last line landed like a hammer. People were whispering now, some clearly connecting dots they hadn't before. The president seemed to realize she was losing the crowd, so she ordered her convoy to retreat. They turned their golf carts around, but not before one of the drivers shot me a glare that could have stripped paint. The rest of the day was smooth sailing. By the time the fundraiser wrapped up, we'd raised over $5,000. I sent a check to the Flood Relief Fund the next morning, along with a note crediting every donor who had attended the bridge event. The local paper ran a follow-up story with photos of smiling families and donation jars overflowing with cash. The HOA, predictably, was not mentioned. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. I'd learned by now that silence from the HOA was like the eye of a hurricane, calm on the surface, but chaos brewing underneath. The next storm hit the following Wednesday. I was coming back from town when I saw a county road crew truck parked by the bridge. 2 workers were unloading orange barriers and traffic cones. I pulled over. What's going on? Got an order to close this bridge for safety inspections, one of them said. From who? County Engineering Office. That didn't smell right. I called the county engineer directly. His answer was immediate. We didn't send anyone. That's not us. I turned back to the workers. You've been had. This is private property, and whoever told you to block it off didn't have the authority. They looked at each other, shrugged, and packed their gear back up. As they drove away, I spotted the HOA vice president's car parked a little too conveniently down the road. He pulled away fast when I walked toward him. That was it. I called my lawyer again. This time, we weren't just talking trespass. We were talking about interference with property rights and possible impersonation of a county official. He was practically giddy at the thought of it. But the HOA wasn't done. 2 nights later, my cameras caught a van pulling up to the gates. A man in coveralls got out, carrying what looked like a locksmith's kit. He worked on the keypad for nearly 10 minutes before giving up and leaving. I ran the plates, rented van, paid for in cash. I started sleeping with my phone next to me, notifications on full volume. Every motion alert from the bridge had me checking the feed instantly. My patience was thinning, and I wasn't alone. Neighbors who'd once been neutral were now openly complaining about the HOA's behavior. The real twist came when I got a call from an unfamiliar number. The man on the line introduced himself as a former HOA board member who'd moved away 2 years earlier. I heard about your situation, he said. You should know they've pulled this before. Different target, same tactics. They think if they make enough noise, people will give in. He also told me something I hadn't known. The HOA's annual meeting was coming up in a month, and board elections were on the agenda. That planted a seed. The next week, I started talking quietly to my neighbors, the ones fed up with the bridge nonsense. It turned out there were more of them than I expected. Some had been burned by the HOA in other disputes, fines for unsightly garden sheds, threats over fence height, even a citation for hanging laundry outside. A plan started forming. If enough of them showed up to the meeting, they could vote the current board out. I couldn't vote. My property wasn't part of the HOA, but I could encourage and, let's say, inspire. I hosted a casual barbecue at my place the Saturday before the meeting. No official speeches, just food, music, and quiet conversations about making changes in leadership. I didn't have to push hard, the resentment was already there. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down on their attacks. The president sent out a newsletter accusing me of sowing division and threatening the harmony of the neighborhood. They even claimed I'd endangered lives by restricting bridge access. The irony, given their midnight bolt-cutter escapades, was lost on them. The night of the meeting, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set. My cameras caught the clubhouse parking lot filling up like it was election night in a small town, which, in a way, it was. As I locked the gates behind me, I realized the war over the bridge was almost over. But the way she looked at me, like she still had one card left to play, told me the ending was going to have one more twist. I didn't have to wait long for that last twist. 4 days after the vandalism incident, I got a certified letter in the mail, stamped with the seal of the county court. The HOA president, now acting on her own, had filed for an emergency injunction to restore community access to the bridge. Her claim? That the bridge was critical infrastructure, and that I was unlawfully depriving residents of safe passage. It was the legal equivalent of throwing a Hail Mary pass while blindfolded. But it meant I'd have to show up in court, which was clearly what she wanted. My lawyer, of course, was delighted. "This is perfect," he said, flipping through her filing like it was a menu at his favorite restaurant. "She's just handed us the stage to lay out everything they've done. We can put it all on record: trespassing, property damage, fraudulent filings, the whole thing." The court date was set for the following Thursday. In the days leading up to it, I noticed something interesting. The former HOA president was suddenly everywhere. She was at the grocery store, the post office, even the gas station, cornering people, telling them I was about to steal the bridge forever. It was like she was trying to build a last-minute PR campaign in the world's smallest town. The morning of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse wearing my cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt. She was already there, sitting in the front row with a stack of papers so thick you'd think she was suing the federal government. She didn't look at me when I walked in, which I took as a good sign. People usually look you in the eye when they think they're going to win. When our case was called, she went first. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. She told the judge that for decades the bridge had been treated as a public road, that closing it off was dangerous, and that I was using unnecessary force to keep the community out. She even teared up at one point, talking about the heart of our neighborhood being locked away. I'll give her this, she could have sold tickets to that performance. Then it was my turn. My lawyer started with the property deed, showing the bridge had been in my name for over 10 years. He introduced photos of the damaged chains, the cut locks, the trespassing incidents, the forged easement filing. We played clips from my security cameras, grainy night footage of bolt cutters at work, a locksmith's kit by the gates, and of course, the president herself spray painting, "Traitor," in the middle of the night. The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of her lawyer's pen tapping the table. When my lawyer finished, the judge leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said, addressing her directly, "do you dispute that you were on his property without permission on these occasions?" She hesitated just a second too long. "I was acting in the community's best interest." "That's not what I asked," the judge said. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, my client." The judge held up a hand. "Enough. I've seen the evidence. The property is his. He's entitled to control access. This injunction is denied." It was over in less than 10 minutes. She didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. But outside on the courthouse steps, she stopped and turned. "You may have won today," she said quietly, "but people will remember what you did." I almost laughed. "I hope they do. Maybe it'll remind them not to mess with things that aren't theirs." For a few weeks after that, life actually returned to normal. The bridge was quiet except for the occasional neighbor waving as they drove past. The new HOA board honored their promise to leave me alone. The former president, stripped of her title and her influence, kept her distance. Then one afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was the mail carrier, holding a thick envelope. "Thought you'd want this sooner rather than later," she said with a grin. Inside was a letter from the new HOA board. It was short, just a few sentences thanking me for my patience during a difficult chapter, and offering to purchase a formal easement for emergency use. They even included a fair offer. I thought about it for a few days. Truth be told, I didn't hate the idea. Giving emergency vehicles guaranteed access without giving the HOA a foothold was a win-win. I had my lawyer draft a contract that was airtight: no residential use, no public claim, just a specific clause for emergencies. The board signed without argument. It should have been the end of the story. And for everyone else, it was. But a week later, I ran into the former president at the feed store. She was standing in line, buying birdseed, and she looked older somehow, tired, deflated. She saw me, and for a second I thought she might launch into another speech. Instead, she just shook her head. "You'll never understand what this bridge meant to us," she said. "I think I do," I replied. "The difference is, I also understand what it means to own something." She didn't answer, just paid for her birdseed and walked out. The months rolled by without incident. The gate stayed up, the keypad worked without a hitch, and the emergency easement sat in my file cabinet, untouched. Every so often, I'd catch a golf cart slowing at the end of the bridge, just long enough for the driver to look at it before rolling away. And then, one crisp fall morning, I stood on the bridge with a coffee in hand, watching the sun burn off the mist over the creek. For the first time since this whole mess started, the view felt peaceful. It wasn't just about winning. It was about drawing a line and holding it, even when it would have been easier to give in. About making it clear that property rights weren't negotiable just because someone wanted them badly enough. The funny thing? In the end, the bridge was still just a bridge. But it had also become something else. A reminder that sometimes the only way to keep what's yours is to be willing to fight for it, no matter how absurd the battle gets. And if the HOA ever forgot that lesson, well, I still had the bolt cutters they dropped on my driveway. Just in case.